Good morning. We have a lot of visitors today, and we are grateful that you are here. And don't know what necessarily has brought you to our assembly today. Maybe visiting friends or family. Maybe you live in the community and you're looking for a church home. But if we can help you in any way, we hope that you will speak up and let us know what we can do to serve you and to help you. We are or have been studying through the book of James on Sunday morning, and we find ourselves at James chapter 3 this morning. And so I invite you to turn your Bibles there with me. We'll be looking at the first part of this chapter. As you think about the book of James, we've already mentioned this, but I'll just say it again. Many look at it as their favorite book in the Bible. They consider it the book on practical Christianity. And in many respects, it is. It deals with some very personal and practical matters about developing and maturing as a Christian. You know, becoming a Christian is not the end of the journey, really. It's the beginning of a journey of mastery where we each day strive to bring under our control our very being, our lives, every aspect of our lives to the pleasure and pleasing of God in heaven. Paul said in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service or spiritual duty. And that we're not to be conformed to this world, but we're to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that we may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so we obey the gospel. We're excited about being a Christian, but that's not the end of it. That's the beginning of the journey. I know personally of no endeavor in life that's worth pursuing where stagnation or status quo is acceptable. And certainly with respect to being a Christian, that's not true. We should be growing and maturing every day of our lives. The Bible tells us how to do that. Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 24 give us the fruit of the Spirit. Things like love, joy, peace, kindness, goodness, long-suffering. And in that list, one of particular attention this morning is the idea of self-control. That is, taking control of ourselves and letting the actions that we take, the words we speak, what we think, to the very best of our ability to have that under control, restraint, and godly purpose. And that's really what James gets into in James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 this morning as he talks about the tongue. And in essence, the words that James puts before Christians who are interested in maturing and developing themselves is this concept or this idea that we as Christians need to get a grip on our tongues. And he sets forth the reasons for that, the motivations, and the benefit of doing just that. So I invite you to study with me this lesson about self-control as it relates to the use of our tongues from James. The first part of the lesson, or the first point of observation, is found in verses 1 and 2, where James speaks to the problem of the tongue. Read along with me. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that you shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. The problem with the tongue. Here, James begins by cautioning against becoming teachers. And we've talked about that in a recent sermon as well, if I recall correctly, that he's not discouraging people from teaching. In fact, we all ought to be growing to the point where we can teach others. That's part of maturing and progressing as Christians. So he's not saying, don't become a teacher. What he is saying is, accept the responsibility as a weighty one with reverence before God, because in teaching, you use your mouth and you use your tongue, and you and I are responsible for what we say. If I teach someone error, then I'm responsible for teaching them error. And so don't jump behind the podium quickly without taking thought of the weight of the responsibility. So that's where he begins. But notice he says, for we all stumble in many things. James is including himself in this. We all stumble in many things. And if anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect or complete man, able also to bridle the whole body. The tongue and the control of the tongue is an everyday pursuit. It is an everyday task. It is an everyday challenge. Someone has said, in fact, it was Washington Irving, the well-known author, who made this statement. He said, the tongue is the only edge tool that grows sharper with use. If you think about a knife or something of that nature, the more you use it, the more dull it becomes. Not so much with the tongue. It is a tool that the more you use it, and especially in an inappropriate way, the sharper it becomes. So we're talking about an instrument that we have that can be used for good, but so often is used as a weapon that harms and destroys. And so this is no compliment about the edge tool of the tongue. And James certainly makes the same observations in what he says here. He warns about the accountability of our words. A person who has not stumbled over his tongue, James says, is one who is able to boast of complete mastery. If you have not, and if you do not stumble over your tongue, and that stumbling is a unexpected stumbling or falling. It's like walking down a path and you trip over something unexpectedly. And that's so often the way that it goes with our tongue. We didn't mean to say something offensive. We didn't mean to hurt, but we did. And we stumble over our tongues because we don't try to control them. And so he says the reality is we all stumble. Nobody can sit here in this assembly this morning and say, this sermon is not for me, because it is for all of us. And James says we all stumble in many things. Now, a word of caution, just because we all do it doesn't mean we have license to do it. Just because it's something that we all struggle with doesn't mean we shouldn't minimize the need for mastery over our tongues. Let's not get that idea, because that would be the wrong idea. This is not license. And we should never get to the point where we excuse or dismiss the inappropriate things that come from our tongues. The tongue can be a problem, James says. Now, in verses 3 through 8, he's going to give us several pictures of the tongue. I like an analogy. I like to see it. If you're trying to communicate something to me, I want a visual. And James appreciates that same need in instruction and teaching. And so he's going to give us some visuals to look at. The first one is in verse 3. He says, indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. So notice there's a connection. In verse 2, he ends with able to bridle the whole body. So we're talking about bridling a horse. and part of the bridle is the bit that goes into the mouth, and we use that contraption to steer, to direct, and to control that brute beast. A horse is tameable. He is able to be brought under control by the use of this instrument. A very small device, relatively speaking, to the size of that horse or that beast. And so that small device, or with it, we direct and we control a horse. You think about what he's saying about the tongue. The tongue is like this little device and has a lot of control and wields a lot of influence, just like the bit in the horse's mouth. And then he gives a second picture in verse 4. He says, look at the ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. In looking for a formula for how shipbuilders determine how big a rudder needs to be to control the vessel that it's attached to, it appears to me that about 2% of the mass or the size of the submerged part of the boat tells what size the rudder needs to be. So just a very small device relative to the size of the ship. And he talks about a ship that's driven by fierce winds. And maybe you've been on a boat when the wind has picked up. And if the motor is idle, if you're not trying to do anything to direct the craft, you're at the complete mercy of the wind. But if you take control of the boat and you take control of the rudder, you can steer it. And you can influence the direction and the path of that ship regardless of the wind that's trying to direct it. And so we have this picture in our mind, and I hope we're getting these pictures in our minds. Don't let go of them. Think about the horse with the bridle being controlled and directed by the one riding it. And think about the ship here with a small rudder underneath, out of sight. Small relative to the size of the vessel. And yet that little device is what the ship captain is controlling, that is directing that vessel wherever he wants. And then in verses 5 and 6, he gives another picture. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles? And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell, James says. So here's a third picture for us. A spark of fire in a forest can be responsible for kindling a massive forest fire and destroy. We've been given, notice, two, we might say, positive examples as we think about the influence of the tongue. You have a bit in a horse's mouth that controls this animal. You have a ship that has a rudder that very positively and productively controls the ship. But now he turns with a negative look at the use of the tongue. And he's talking about a spark, a little spark that kindles a great fire. On August 24th, 2000, there was a forest fire, wildfire in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And it required over 1,000 firefighters to work on trying to contain that fire. It took 2 weeks to get it under control. Before they got it under control, 80,000 acres of timber was consumed. And a lady by the name of Janice Stevenson was arrested. And she pled guilty of second-degree arson for causing that fire. If you can envision it, she received a 25-year prison sentence, and she was ordered to pay over $42 million in restitution. When she talked to the investigators about what she had done, she admitted to them that she had stopped on the roadside, she had lit a cigarette, and she had tossed the burning match out of the window of the car. She saw it kindle a small fire, and she looked at it, and she decided to just leave it and drive on without getting out and putting it out. She made a decision about the potential damage that she had started that burned 80,000 acres, all the wood, all the property damage, all of the money that went to waste because of that decision. And so think about that when you think about James painting a picture of a little spark igniting a fire. And think about a lady who saw the potential damage that she had initiated, but decided to do nothing about it. And then think about times in our lives where we've sent a spark out of our mouth and we've seen the potential damage that it might end up causing, but we don't get out and put it out. We just drive on and let it be and let happen what may. A spark that kindles a great fire and causes great damage. You think about that illustration, like starting a forest fire, producing a wildfire with our tongues. It requires little effort. Not much effort is required to say something that's going to start a disaster. Rumors, half-truths, grumblings, sarcastic remarks, hurtful things said in the heart or in the heat of the moment, in the heat of anger, or to soothe one's own jealousy, or hateful pride, or even a guilty conscience. All of these smoldering matches have the potential for burning down acres of morale, peace, and unity among people, and in particular, among the body of Christ, the Lord's church. In verses 7 and 8, we get even more imagery that helps us understand the danger. We've seen the potential power and benefit, but also the danger of this little instrument attached to our body. Verses 7 and 8. For every kind of beast and bird or reptile or creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Now the tongue is portrayed as an unruly beast. You think about all of the animals of the world, the kingdom over which God has placed man as ruler over this kingdom, and all of the animals that have been subdued to the will of man. Our zoos are full of them. There's a picture there. We have the ability to tame all of these wild animals, at least to some degree. And yet there's the tongue that we seem to have difficulty bringing under control. And he says it is an unruly evil. It's full of deadly poison. In other words, it's a poisonous beast. And whatever it strikes, whatever it bites, is doomed to destruction, to hurt, to harm. How many times have you been on the receiving end of words that were like poison injected into your life? But then again, how many times have you been on the sending end of the same kinds of words that spewed poison into other people's lives and caused great harm? James says we all stumble over our tongues. In Romans chapter 3, verse 10, Paul is saying and concluding, after looking at the Gentile world and looking at the Jews and getting into Romans chapter 3, he says, in essence, all have sinned. There's none righteous. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But notice what he says in verses 13 and 14. Following on the heels of the fact that there is none righteous, no, not one, he says, their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. When we look at that and we think, what a horrible people. But is it us? Do we do that? Would Paul describe the way we use our tongue the way that he described mankind in Romans chapter 3? In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, Peter says we've spent enough of our past life in doing the will of the Gentiles. He's talking to Christians. You know, there was a time in our life where that may have been acceptable because that's the sphere of influence in which we lived. We lived in the world. We were like the world. We behaved like the world. We talked like the world. And we spewed poison from our mouths. And we didn't really care about who was hurt by it. But we've spent enough of our past time in doing the will of the Gentiles. We're different now. We're Christians now. And we're to be working at mastery to the best of our ability, to the exclusion of no part of our life, the tongue especially. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, Peter said, finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. And so the tongue can be an instrument for great good. It can be an instrument for great evil. And it would be easy to dismiss this morning if James had written this letter and if he had begun the letter with, to all of you who have never obeyed the gospel before. But that's not the way it begins. It's written to Christians, to brethren, to us. And by virtue of the fact that he writes these things to Christians, we must accept that it can be true of us, and this is something that we need to work on. So notice now in verses 9 through 12, the perplexity of the tongue. He stated the problem. He's given us some pictures. Hopefully we have a portrait before us that shows us the good and the bad, where we can assess, like a mirror, looking into our own lives and assess our use of our tongues. But he puts a perplexity before us. Here's some strange things about the use of the tongue, he says in verses 9 through 12. Look at 9 and 10. With it, that is the tongue, with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. You see, we bless God with our mouth and then turn around and say something about a brother or a sister that's not commendable, that's not stated in a way to build up, to encourage, to strengthen. So often it can be to tear down. And James is saying that this is kind of weird. That we, with one day or one moment, we're praising and blessing God, and yet, in the very next breath, we're saying things that destroy and harm those who were created in the image, the similitude of God. It shouldn't be. That's perplexing, James says. Look at verses 11 and 12. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter water at the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh water. These are impossible anomalies in nature. They just don't happen. If you find a spring where water is gushing out of the ground, you don't bend over and take a drink and say, oh, it's fresh and sweet. And then go in for a second drink and you say, oh, it's bitter and sour. Nature understands this. A spring is not going to send forth both sweet and bitter water at the same time. It's just not going to happen. That's an anomaly that's not going to be apparent and visible in nature. If you have an apple tree in your backyard and you get apples off of it this year, next year it's not going to have oranges on it. If you have a vine and it has strawberries on it today, it won't have grapes next year. Nature understands that a seed, a tree, a vine, a plant produces after its kind. And that's the lesson Christians need to get as well. Because if we can get it, we're doing what nature says is impossible. We're doing sweet and bitter. We're doing figs and strawberries. It's just not possible to do two different things, to curse and to bless with the same mouth. Now, it's possible to do that, but not as a Christian. And that's the difference. As a Christian, our sweet fountain ought to send forth sweet water all of the time, and it shouldn't be sending forth both, is the essence of what he's saying. Just as nature gets it, we must as well. And again, it's possible, else James wouldn't be writing and admonishing Christians to do it. There are a couple of Psalms that come into play here. I think of Psalm 34 and verse 13. Keep the tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. If an inspired writes and admonishes us to do something, guess what? We can do it. Or what about Psalm 39 and verse 1? I will guard my mouth, or I will guard my ways lest I sin with my tongue, and I will restrain my mouth with a muzzle, the psalmist says. So we have the ability to do it. How then do we control our tongue? Because so often we'll say things that aren't in harmony with who we profess to be, and then we'll say, well, that's just the way I am. I just speak my mind. Well, that's not okay. It's not okay to just speak your mind, because what it does, it reveals your mind. How do we fix that? James tells us the problem. He gives us some pictures. He tells us how perplexing it is for a spring to send forth two kinds of water, implying that it's perplexing for Christians to do that. So how do you fix it? How do you get the tongue under control? Someone has said God put the tongue behind an ivory fence. And yet, if you think about it, we're able to get right past that ivory gate, that ivory fence, so often to release a beast and a monster. Might I suggest to us this morning that the sum total of the Bible teaches us that changing the tongue takes place in the heart. If you want to change what the tongue does, you have to change what the heart is thinking. James says in James chapter 3 and verse 10 that this just shouldn't be. I think of Matthew chapter 15 and verse 18, where Jesus said, the things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile the man. James's point is, once it gets to the tongue, good luck trying to stop it. We're trying to get a grip on the tongue, but where we really need to start in doing that is at the heart. Not wait till it gets to the mouth and to the tongue, because it's going to be very difficult at that point. A runaway tongue, James says, is not characteristic of godliness. And so we must change our heart to reflect the godliness that we profess. And we can and we must. Proverbs chapter 4 verse 23 says, keep your heart with all diligence, For out of it are the issues of life. And the issues of life are manifested in many ways. One way that the issues of life are manifested is in what we say. So I need to keep my heart with all diligence to influence what I say with my mouth. We can do that. You know, the saying was very popular many years ago, or the acronym, I guess, what would Jesus do? Might I encourage us to read the accounts of Jesus' interaction with humanity, but before you jump right to what would Jesus do, ask yourself the question, what would I do? Or what would I have done? And look at some of the situations where Jesus was spoken against, where he was maligned, where he was ridiculed. And ask yourself right there in that moment, now, what would I have done? Well, I'd have let them have it. I would have given them a piece of my mind. It's interesting we say that, but where does it come from? It comes from the mouth. It's a piece of our mind. Because the mind controls what comes out of the mouth. What would I do? And then when I have a good handle on what I would have done in that moment, look and see what Jesus did. And think about the description that's given of him in Isaiah chapter 53. Where he opened not his mouth. Sometimes it's just best not to open our mouths. And there was never any deceit in his mouth, Isaiah said. So not so much what did Jesus do immediately. What would I have done? And then what did Jesus do? A couple of other passages here. Matthew chapter 12, verses 34 through 37. Where Jesus says to the religious leaders of his day, you brood of vipers. How can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil things. But I say to you that, listen now, every idle word men may speak, they should give an account in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. We're accountable to God for the things that we say. We are accountable to God for the way that we use our tongues. And James begins by saying, be careful. Take this responsibility soberly, because we stumble in many ways with respect to our tongues. We have control over it. We can steer ourselves like a horse is steered with a bridle. We can control our lives and our influence like a ship is controlled with a rudder. Or we can start a fire of destruction that hurts and harms even beyond our ability to imagine. But that's just not the Christian way. And it is perplexing to James, it's perplexing to God, and it ought to be perplexing to us if we, as professing Christians, are able to say in one breath, God, I love you, I thank you, I glorify you, and I honor you, and yet in the next breath, take a person created in his image and tear them to pieces. It's perplexing. But the only way that we're going to get a control of it is to change our hearts, to change the way we think, because that's what controls what we say. It's easy to say, well, sometimes I just speak my mind, but that's nonsense. That's not what Christians do. It's an entirely different thing to realize that I lack self-control and that it's a heart problem. And when I realize that, I need to do my due diligence to fix it. May God help us to take to heart the message that James gives us about the tongue, to get a grip on it, and to make sure that we don't let words come from our mouths, whether we intended them to or not, to cause great harm destruction, and damage. This morning, if you're not a Christian, you need to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism for the remission of your sins. Maybe you are a Christian. Maybe you've not been mindful of the way that you use that wonderful instrument that God has given all of us to speak truth and salvation into the lives of lost people. Maybe I've not done that the way that I should. Maybe I've just let my mouth go. Maybe I've encouraged us in some way this morning to take control, to get a grip on our tongues, and to change our hearts so that we don't have to worry about what comes out of our mouths. If you're subject to the invitation in any way this morning, we hope you'll use this opportunity and come as we stand and sing.